Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for the inaugural webinar of the Alan and Joan Bildner Center for the Study of Jewish Life. Today's lecture webinar is the Ruth and Alvin Rockoff Annual Lecture, and we sincerely thank the Rockoff family for their generosity in establishing this annual lecture on Israel. As everyone knows, the Bildner Center is primarily self-supporting, so these endowed lectures make it possible to bring high-quality programming to the public, and we're just thrilled about today's speaker. Our speaker, and I'll give a more formal introduction after the ground rules, is Yossi Klein Halevi, who will be speaking on the topic, Update from Jerusalem. So these are the ground rules. Many of you know them because you have participated before. This is a webinar, so you cannot be seen, even though there are right now over 150 of you in the room. You can listen to Yossi and also read through closed captions. So look on your screen and there are closed captions, the three dots at the bottom, if you want to get a transcript, a simultaneous transcript. The presentation is being recorded and will be available on the Bildner Center website in a few weeks. In this format, you are muted, so please make sure you are muted in case you aren't. And if you have a question, please type it into the chat. I will be monitoring this, and the I is me, Nancy Sinkoff, the Academic Director of the Alan and Joan Bildner Center for the Study of Jewish Life, and Professor of Jewish Studies and History here at Rutgers University, where I've taught for 28 years. I will moderate the chat, and I will pose the questions to Yossi when he is done. Because we have over 160 people, and more are joining every second right now, attending this, I will not be able to ask all the questions you have of Yossi. You should know that he is not that I'm saying he's going to answer your questions in other forum, but he runs a weekly podcast that you can listen to, and I'm going to say more about that in a second. So you have many opportunities, I hope, once you've learned from him today, to learn from him in other fora, including his written work. So let me introduce him formally. And let me also say that I've been following Yossi Klein Halevi's career since he was Yossi Klein, which is back in the day. Yossi Klein Halevi is a senior fellow at the Shalom Hartman Institute in Jerusalem and one of the most prominent lecturers in North America on Israeli culture, history, society, and politics. His 2013 book, Like Dreamers, which was about the '67 war, won the Jewish Book Council's Everett Book of the Year Award. His most recent book, Letters to My Palestinian Neighbor, which came out in 2018, but then also in a new edition, which included responses from Arab Israelis or Palestinian Israelis to his book, was a New York Times bestseller, and it has appeared in 12 languages. He is currently writing a book about the meaning of Jewish survival. Yossi Klein Halevi has also written for leading op-ed pages in North America and is a former contributing editor to the New Republic. He co-directs the Hartman Institute's Muslim Leadership Initiative, the MLI. It's a unique program that has taught more than 150 emerging young Muslim leaders in North America about Judaism, Jewish identity, and Israel. And together with Daniel Hartman, he is a co-host of the Hartman Institute's podcast, For Heaven's Sake, the Shema, right? The #1 Jewish podcast in the English-speaking world. And so you can listen to him often wherever you get your podcasts. So I now want to welcome Yossi to the screen and to all of you. 175 people are in the room right now. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Professor Sinkoff. Thank you for having me. Thank you for your warm words. And hi, everyone. Shana Tova. Good year to everyone. I'm a bit distracted at the moment for two reasons. One is my mind is very much on the White House and the meeting between Trump and Netanyahu. I hesitate to call this a fateful meeting because we've been here before. We've been at these supposedly fateful moments where Trump announces an imminent breakthrough, an end to the war, release of hostages. And depending on who you blame, and I tend to blame at this point both our government, meaning the Israeli government, and of course Hamas, uh, the breakthroughs never happened. This time, Trump has put on the table what I think is a credible plan, is the most interesting and comprehensive plan that we've seen since the beginning of this war. A plan not only for ending the war, but actually for taking us considerably further down the line, expanding the Abraham Accords. I'll have more to say about that a little later. Um, even at least paying lip service to the possibility of renewing a two-state solution uh, on the table. Whether Netanyahu can agree to this, given the constraints of his hard right coalition, is of course the open question. There's an irony which really should tell you something about this moment in Israeli society, which is that the families of the hostages released a public appeal to Trump not to let Netanyahu sabotage the deal. So that's where we are. We have desperate families who are appealing to a foreign leader to save their loved ones from the perceived indifference of the Israeli prime minister. So that's one source of my distraction at the moment. The second is that a couple of months ago, my wife Sarah and I moved to a new apartment. Those of you who know Jerusalem will know Mount Herzl in the southwest part of the city, and we live right next to Mount Herzl. But more importantly, for what I'm about to say, we live directly across the way from the National Military Cemetery. And while I was waiting for the program to begin, I was sitting here in my study and listening to the eulogies being broadcast on loudspeakers of a soldier being buried. And just before we began the program, there was the honor guards of the 3 rounds of firing in honor of the fallen soldier. So I mention that I think as a way of really trying to frame this conversation, because while I'll be dealing with the big issues, what really preoccupies us here on the day to day in Israel uh, are the stories that seldom get reported abroad. The texture of life here has of course fundamentally changed since October 7th, and we are still, for all of the debates, necessary debates, over continuing the war, over the moral issues around the war. We experience this war in the most basic way possible. We experience it as a war. We experience it as a society where everyone is at least everyone knows someone who's fallen. Everyone is no more than one or two people removed from the news, and so that's really, those are the issues that I'm bringing to this conversation at this moment, uh, to widen the lens and deal with the issue of our conversation. I'd like to frame the situation of the Jewish people today as being confronted by a three-front war. And we are experiencing a convergence of multiple threats, external as well, I believe, as internal. And the first of the three fronts that we're we're fighting is, of course, the military. And we are currently fighting against seven countries or seven countries or terror entities, from Gaza to Yemen to Lebanon, Iraq, and the source is all in Iran. So basically, this is the Iranian-Israeli war with multiple smaller fronts. And I think that that's a very important way of understanding the war in Gaza. For all of its severity, for all of its horror, it is from the Israeli perspective, as we experience this war, it is one front among many. The second of this front, of this three-front war, is the war for Israel's legitimacy. And more broadly, I would call it the war against the mid-20th century Jewish story of destruction and renewal. It is a war against the legitimacy of the Jewish reclamation of power, against in Israel. That is the war is being fought against the legitimacy of our right to defend ourselves militarily. It is a war against Jewish hard power. And in the diaspora, especially America, it is increasingly a war against the Jewish community's political and financial clout. So this front has two aspects, and it's a war against the legitimacy of the reclamation of Jewish power, and it is an attempt to restore the Jewish people to the pre-Holocaust condition of powerlessness. And the third front, which is here in Israel, an internal front, is the war or the struggle to save Israeli democracy. And I would call it a struggle for saving Israel as a decent country. And here again, more deeply, I would define this as a struggle to save the Israeli success story. Because if we go the way, God forbid, of Hungary, if we become a Jewish version of Hungary, then we are going to see, I fear, a massive emigration of Israeli liberals who are the backbone of Startup Nation, of the Israeli success story. So this is a very fateful moment. We're seeing really the convergence of three fronts. And part of the profound disorientation that we're feeling is precisely this, that we're being attacked from without. Anti-Semitism today, I believe, is more global than it has ever been in history for the obvious reason of social media. But we are experiencing more attacks on Jews, whether it's psychological, ideological, or physical, around the world simultaneously than I think at any other time. Not, of course, there were other times in our history where we experienced attacks much more intensively. But in terms of the spread of the threat that we're facing, I believe this is the most global we've ever experienced. And at the same time, we are experiencing an internal rift and this deep sense that many of us have that at our most desperate moment, at the moment when Israel most needs a morally credible leadership, we have instead what I regard as the least morally credible government in our history. And so let me unpack each of these three fronts. And if I don't have time to get to all of them, then hopefully this will come out in our Q&A session. So beginning with the military conflict. If we go back to October 8th, when Israeli society is trying to determine what just happened and how do we respond, you can see a reaction emerging that already then is in direct variance with how much of the world understood October 7th, let alone what was about to happen in Gaza. And the radically different ways in which the Israeli public, and here I say virtually the entire Jewish Israeli public on October 8th, agreed with what I'm about to lay out. And that is, first of all, the question of why did October 7th happen? Now, around the world, the answer that was being offered was pretty conventional. Israel, to one extent or another, brought October 7th on itself with the occupation, with the siege of Gaza, by denying the Palestinians a state. And so the perception abroad was, to one extent or another, that Israel really helped bring October 7th on itself. And what really did you Israelis expect when you occupy another people, when you treat Palestinians the way you've treated them? Of course, sooner or later, there's going to be a reaction. Now, some, like former President Obama, said this with a certain amount of sadness, reluctance, perhaps. He didn't really want to blame Israel on October 8th, but in effect, he did. Others reacted without any equivocation at all and simply laid the blame entirely on Israel. And of course, many celebrated October 7th. The way that October 7th was understood across the board in Jewish Israeli society, and I'm emphasizing Jewish Israeli society because Arab society obviously has a different dynamic. But from the mainstream left rightward, virtually all of Jewish Israel understood October 7th not in terms of an occupied people revolting against their oppressor, but as the expression of radical Islamism's genocidal intention toward the state of Israel. And so from the beginning, you have this very different way of understanding why October 7th happened. And because Israelis understood that October 7th was not about the occupation, the Israeli left was able to support the war in Gaza and against Hezbollah and eventually against Iran, with no less determination than the rest of the political system. The second major difference between how Israelis understood October 7th and how much of the world understood it is that for Israelis, this was never just about Hamas or the Palestinians. What began on October 7th was the Iranian-Israeli war. And I think most Israelis instinctively understood this on October 8th. And so while most of the world was focused with an increasing obsessiveness on the Gaza front, again, for understandable reasons, that certainly was the most dramatic and horrific of all the fronts, Israelis were very conscious of being surrounded on almost all of our borders by proxies of Iran, which was Iran's great strategic victory over Israel in these last 20 or so years. Iran succeeded in effectively surrounding Israel on almost every border. Another way in which the Israeli public understood October 7th and at variance with how much of the rest of the world increasingly saw October 7th, saw the aftermath, rather, of October 7th, was what was the purpose of Israel going to war? And what we began to hear more and more vocally, and really more and more as a taunt, was this is Israel's war of revenge against Hamas, or more broadly against the Palestinians. Now, of course, revenge was very much present for for many Israelis. It probably still is. But what much of the world didn't understand was the profound strategic rationale that animated the Israeli public's support for this war. And that was the understanding that we had that this is the purpose of this war is to restore the credibility of Israeli deterrence. Israel had just been delivered the worst blow in its history by its weakest enemy. As a consequence of that, our deterrence was at an all-time historic low. And in the Middle East, the lone non-Arab, non-Muslim state will not survive in the long term without a credible posture of military deterrence. And so for, I would say, most of us, the strategic purpose of this war was very clear. Beyond revenge, there really was the need to restore our military credibility. And many of us framed, and I believe rightly so, framed this war in existential terms. And this was also something that was not understood abroad, that this war was not just a blow to Israel, but we experienced it as an existential threat. We experienced October 7th as a kind of pre-enactment in microcosm of the destruction of Israel. That's what the destruction of Israel would look like. Your border is overrun. The army is in complete disarray. Citizens are left to fend for themselves against a terrorist army. That's what the destruction of Israel would look like. That was the ultimate Israeli nightmare. And that's what happened on October 7th. And so we framed this war very much in existential terms. Now, I've heard many Israelis since October 7th say almost casually that we're back in a 1948 moment. On the surface of it, it seems absurd because Israel in 1948, we were 500,000 people here. We were fighting literally house to house. And while October 7th was a kind of a 1948 moment, we very quickly took the lead militarily, and the ruins of Gaza 2 years later attest to the fact that we have a great deal of power. But in one sense, I think that there is truth to this sense that we're back in some way in 1948. If you look at the trajectory of Israel's wars, starting with the War of Independence in 48, there's a very interesting pattern that emerges. In 1948, we fought 7 Arab countries. 1967, the Six-Day War, we fought 3. 1973, the Yom Kippur War, we fought 2. 1982, the First Lebanon War, 1. And then every war since 1982 has been a one-front confrontation. Now we've come seemingly full circle back to a 7-front war. So in that sense, it feels, and again, whether it's objectively true or not, the experience of this war in these last 2 years is existential. Now, I mentioned that Israeli society on October 8th, Israeli Jewish society, was virtually united around the need to wage this war, and was in fact united around the idea that we need to destroy the Hamas regime, that nothing less than removing Hamas from power will be a credible response to October 7th. But a lot has happened since then, and today Israel is once again a deeply divided society. And the main source of the division are the hostages. The question of what do we prioritize? Do we prioritize the defeat, excuse me, do we prioritize the defeat of Hamas, which is the government's position, and which was, I would say, the position of a majority, a strong majority of Israeli society through the first year or so of the war. That was certainly my position as well. And the new position, which represents a majority of, according to polls, around 70% of the country, is that we need to prioritize the release of the hostages, even if it means ending the war. And Netanyahu, of course, is well aware of those polls, and I'm hoping that he's bringing that keen awareness with him into his meeting right now. So the first shift has been the realization that the Israeli public no longer prioritizes destroying Hamas, but rather saving the hostages. And I think that one of the reasons that has accounted for this shift, and certainly it helped influence my own position, was the gradual restoration of the credibility of our deterrence. And beginning with the beepers in Lebanon, moving toward the extraordinary 12 days in the skies of Iran, where we maintained uncontested domination and didn't lose a single plane. I think it was one of the most extraordinary moments in Israeli military history, maybe in the history of modern warfare. And so the sense that we have gone a long way toward restoring our deterrence makes it easier to think of some kind of a solution in Gaza that may not be a definitive victory against Hamas. Although the Trump plan, and I think this is for Israel, this is really one of the great appeals, the Trump plan is conditioned on Hamas leaders being exiled from Gaza and effectively ending Hamas rule. Now, another reason for me, and this is a compelling reason, for ending the war is to prevent the far-right elements in the government from creating a moral catastrophe that will implicate the state of Israel and indirectly the Jewish people. The goal of the far right is to expel the Palestinians from Gaza and rebuild the settlements that were destroyed in Gaza in 2005. And that was initially, at least the first phase of emptying Gaza from Palestinians, that was initially proposed by Trump. And it was a disastrous moment because he gave permission to the worst instincts in Israeli society. He gave legitimacy to those instincts. Now, of course, Trump very quickly stopped talking about removing the Palestinians from Gaza, but the far right has held on to that permission that Trump initially granted. And so Trump has done, I think, tremendous damage to Israeli political discourse and to our moral credibility. I would make the case that if we knew for certain that Netanyahu was committed to ending the war and bringing the hostages back, and that his play in Gaza City was intended to pressure Hamas into an agreement, then I would say there's a credible case to be made for this phase of the Gaza war. But given the fact that we're dealing with a government that is beholden to the far right, given the fact that Netanyahu has never made clear what his political scenario is for the morning after in Gaza, and given the fact that the only elements in the government that have made their positions clear are the far-right ministers, then my deep sense is that the war, the extension of the war into Gaza City, is a risk that we can't afford to take. We should know more in the coming days. I would doubt that there'll be a breakthrough tonight, but if Trump really wants to push this, we're in a very peculiar position where we're looking to Trump to save us from ourselves. And Trump is certainly an unlikely savior, but this is the Middle East. Let's look briefly at the moral dilemmas around this war. And my framing for Israel's moral challenges are two positions. On the one hand, we must do everything possible to protect ourselves, to protect innocent Palestinian civilians. And even when we are fighting an existential war against an enemy without moral restraint, we cannot act similarly. So that's one very basic and I hope self-evident position. The second moral imperative for me of this war is to deny terrorism immunity behind civilians. The significance of this war for the world, whether the world knows it or not, is the question of whether it is possible in the 21st century, in the age of social media, for a Western democratic society to effectively wage war against terrorism. And that's an open question now, because Hamas has figured out how to weaponize the conscience of humanity. And so the greatest protection for Hamas are the deaths of its civilians and the outraged conscience of the world. And I frame this not as only as a strategic dilemma for Israel, but even more so as a moral dilemma. And we're carrying this for the world, again, whether the world wants us to carry this or not. What will be determined in Israel's war, it's on multiple fronts against the Iranian alliance, is whether it's possible to defeat terrorism in the age of social media. Now, the conditions in which the IDF fights in Gaza are, I would say, probably unprecedented, even in the realm of asymmetrical warfare. Thousands of homes throughout Gaza have been booby-trapped. Hamas, of course, Hamas fighters don't wear uniforms. They blend in with the civilian population. Hundreds of kilometers of tunnels, which no army has had to contend with. And so the conditions in which we're fighting are qualitatively different from what other armies have encountered. And yet, for all of that, and I by no means take that for granted, I by no means minimize it, I believe that we still need to ask ourselves some difficult questions. And my deep fear is that after 2 years of the most brutal fighting that we have ever endured, that the IDF will emerge from this war in some ways transformed. And I worry about the long-term impact on the young officers coming through the ranks now, and this is their experience of combat. I worry about a growing recklessness that I sense within the army. And I ask myself whether, even given the need to loosen the rules of engagement, given the circumstances that we're fighting under, even with those looser rules of engagement, are we still violating norms that the IDF would never have considered in the past? These are questions, and I raise them. I don't have answers, but I believe it's important for us to ask these questions. And one of the things that worries me about the conversation today about Israel is that we're caught in this kind of a loop where, on the one hand, defenders of Israel speak of the IDF, continue to speak about the IDF as the most moral army in the world, as if nothing has changed in the last 2 years, as if there are no questions that need to be raised. And on the other hand, we are the least moral army. We're an army, we're a genocidal army. Between these two poles of the most moral army in the world and a genocidal army, I believe we need to start exploring and looking to see who are we really? Because I don't think that either of these extreme characterizations are useful. Nancy, how much more time do we have?
You have about 2 minutes.
Well, I've only gotten to the first front. How about if I take 5 and we'll
You can,
split the difference?
seeing as I'm a jazz aficionado, you can definitely take 5.
Okay.
Paul Desmond is happy. Go for it.
Okay. So the second front is the war against the Jewish story, the war against the Jewish return home, the legitimacy of a 4,000-year story. And I was walking on Broadway on the Upper West Side last year, and there were hostage posters on the lampposts all along the Upper West Side. And someone had taken the trouble to go from one poster to the other and spray paint with black spray paint just the faces, erasing the faces, a literal defacement. And I'm mentioning that because that, for me, is the metaphor of how this war is being fought against the legitimacy of our story. Our story is being systematically erased. Every stage of the Zionist return, the Jewish return home, is being turned into an expression of evil, beginning with the founding of Zionism in 19th century Europe. That is an expression of white settler colonialism. The founding of the state in 1948 is reduced to ethnic cleansing, the Nakba. The society that Israel created after 1948, apartheid. And now finally, with the Gaza war, we come to the last station, and that is genocide. After genocide, after you have become a Nazi country, there's nothing left. The indictment is now complete. Now, in order to do that, in order to take every stage of the Jewish return home and turn it into something sinister, you need to erase, and this brings me back to the metaphor of erasing the faces of the hostage faces. You need to erase the context of our story. So, for example, if the founding of Zionism, to conclude that the founding of Zionism is nothing more than an expression of white settler colonialism, requires erasing 4,000 years of Jewish history. And of course, it requires erasing the real Israeli society, which is a majority descendants of Jews from the Middle East. To reduce the creation of Israel to the Nakba requires erasing the fact that 3 years after the Holocaust, the Arab world tried to destroy the last best hope of the Jewish people. It means erasing the fact that there was a deal on the table and Israel said yes, and the Palestinian leadership and the Arab world said no. And of course, it means erasing what some call the Jewish Nakba, which was the effective expulsion or flight of close to 1 million Jews from the Muslim world. To turn Israel into an apartheid state requires erasing the very complicated experience of Arab Israelis, admittedly complicated, but by no means the story of apartheid. And finally, of course, to turn Israel's war in Gaza into genocide requires eliminating the inconvenient presence of Hamas. And those of you who read the essay in the New York Times op-ed page by the Israeli-born Holocaust historian Omer Bartov
Bartov.
might have been struck by his virtual ignoring of Hamas. The piece dealt almost exclusively with Israel, as if Israel had declared war against civilian Palestinian society, and there was no Hamas. So this is, in this very complicated moment, this is the mix that we're dealing with. And I'll conclude with 2 points. The first is that the Jewish world today, we're all feeling rage and fear, but we are divided over what makes us angry and what makes us afraid. And on one side, I hate to call it the Jewish right, because I think there are many of us who feel this way who are not on the right. But one position, one expression of fear and rage is the question, how is it possible that less than a century after the Holocaust, the Jewish people and the Jewish state finds itself once again cast in the role of ultimate evil, the symbol of human evil? And that's one expression of Jewish rage. Another expression is, how is it possible after the Holocaust that the Jewish people, the Jewish state, whether justified or not, has opened the way to being put on trial for the accusations of genocide, that it's even being debated? How did we allow ourselves morally to get to this point? And for me, I think we need to embrace both of these expressions of rage and angst, because they're both essential elements in understanding the complexity of this time. And the last point that I'll say is that how I feel we need to speak about Israel at this moment is by learning 2 languages simultaneously. The first language is directed toward those who are trying to criminalize the Jewish state and the Jewish people, turn us into the world's criminals. And that is a language of contempt. We owe those who accuse us in that way deserve no moral accounting from us, only pushback. But there's a second language that I believe we need to learn, and that's an internal Jewish language. And that's a language where we ask ourselves, we're better than Syria, we're better than Yemen, we're better than our neighbors, but is that really the measure? Is that where it's come to? And how do we hold ourselves morally accountable, even while the lynch mob is calling for our blood? That's a challenge that we face today that I don't know if Jews have ever faced in quite the same level of intensity in the past. And we know that we are not guilty of what they accuse us of doing, but we also know that we're not quite innocent anymore either. And how do we balance that? How do we handle this justified rage that we feel toward the return of the criminalization of the Jew? And on the other hand, an honest examination that begins with our government, that looks at how did we allow ourselves to have a government like this, and that allows us to really begin the process of examining where we are and what we need to do to dig ourselves out of this hole. So let's open for the conversation.
We have many questions, and I will not take my prerogative right now. I often do at the beginning. I have lots of thoughts about your really thoughtful, and if I can say, internally self-reflective, appropriate to this time of the year, questioning about all of these narratives and how Jews understand themselves. And I think that you've written a lot about that we need a new narrative because the older ones are not working. But I will hold back on some questions. I just want to clarify to everyone out there, yes, this was recorded. It will be up on the Bildner Center site. You'll be able to share it widely, as you should, as well as attending other Bildner Center events. We do a lot of programming related to Israel. But let me start with some questions from the audience. I have to bring up my document, which I made while you were speaking. So let me just say that the questions range, and it's perhaps not surprising, between what's happening in Israel and what's happening in the United States. And I realize that you sit there, not here, but because of the close alliance between the two governments, there's a lot of conversation about that, about these two governments who seem to be in sync and yet not in sync. And, in a half an hour, we'll know how much they are in sync. So let me start a little bit with those questions. Um, um, so do you see a parallel between the Israeli and U.S. far right, and how they are controlling or certainly controlling the narratives and behaviors right now? And if so, what does that mean for this historic alliance between the U.S. and Israel in terms of foreign policy, et cetera?
In other words, is there a convergence between the Israeli far right and the American far right?
Yeah, that's the question. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that Netanyahu has learned a lot from Trump, and we've seen in the last couple of years the emergence of conspiratorial thinking on the right to a degree that we haven't seen before. I mean, we did experience it to some extent after the Rabin assassination, when you had significant elements on the Israeli right uh, believing that the assassination was actually a left-wing plot to discredit the right that wasn't supposed to happen. It was supposed to be is the expression, a false flag, and then it went wrong. So you do have conspiratorial thinking on the Israeli right, but nothing like we've experienced in the last couple of years, to the extent that you'll hear it pretty often from right wingers here, that there was a cabal in the army that knew in advance of October 7th and didn't warn Netanyahu because they wanted October 7th to happen to discredit him and bring him down. The latest iteration of this conspiracy theory is that there was a cabal in the army that helped organize, that helped plan October 7th. So, you're dealing with a similar kind of insanity. There's a certain mindset where you realize that nothing is stable anymore. Nothing is solid. I think that one of the advantages we have, this wasn't the question, but I'll say it anyway, as a society, is that the Israeli moderate left and the center is not progressive. And so what we're experiencing here is not a replay of progressives versus the far right. It's the far right versus the old Democratic Party. and
You know what? I need
and
you to clarify. I'm sorry. I'm a stickler for some of this language because having studied Jewish cosmopolitanism and internationalism my whole life, when you say, can you just clarify? And I also just got from Europe or progressive being something else. When you say progressives, do you mean the so-called left flank of the U.S. Democratic Party? I mean,
yes,
who?
yes,
Okay,
that's what I
so
mean.
you're saying the moderate Israeli left, old kibbutznikim, those guys are not
Yeah,
quote
or
progressives,
even Meretz,
right?
Meretz, which is to the left of Labor, although
Right.
Labor and Meretz now merged in one party,
Of course.
and it's headed by a former general, Yair Golan, which is
Right.
inconceivable, for Meretz, the hard left party, to ever have a former general as its leader.
Right.
So October 7th has shifted the discourse here, and the truth is that progressive, the hard left never really took deep root in Israel, even on the left. I mean, if you read Haaretz, you'll see elements of, you'll see a hard left discourse, but it's so unrepresentative. And I say that as a faithful Haaretz reader. It's you just take certain columnists there, really with 2 grains of salt, and the left and centrist liberal Israeli discourse uh, is is much more traditional liberal than what you're hearing in much of the American left. And I think that that's very important for the long-term health of Israeli society. It also explains the opposition. We have an opposition that includes uh, Bennett and Lieberman on the right, and Lapid in the center, Yair Golan on the left. And it's hard to imagine that kind of opposition in the United States. So I think that as pathological as much of the Israeli right has become, our our opposition is still very healthy.
Right. Right. Maybe healthy ideologically, not so powerful, somewhat feckless, but that's,
Yeah, well,
the problem everywhere is one has ideas that are robust, but how actually, and I'm not a political scientist, but how they actually get affected in these various political systems and what wins
right.
elections and money and quote, and what I call anti-social media. But that's sort of in the a bigger question right now. But let me just ask a couple of sort of point blank questions. You may not want to answer them. Someone wants to know vis-a-vis the role of Jewish Americans who, and again, there are many, many different, there's such a wide spectrum of attitudes right now towards this modern state of Israel. But when you read about protests against the war on the part of Jewish Americans, is that something as a Jerusalemite, is that something that gives you hope, if you will? Or do you despair of this because of this disjuncture in the experience of living this war? So that is, from your perspective, what do you think the role is, if there is any role for diasporic Jews, particularly those in North America, but we know there are Jews living in Argentina and France and Hungary and other places as well. But obviously the European
Yeah.
experience
Well,
shapes
look,
things.
I believe that if Israel truly is the center of Jewish life today, which I think it is, not only from an ideological perspective, but from a very practical perspective.
Demographic.
We're the largest Jewish community in the world. We're the one place where the public space is shaped by Jewish civilization. And so, for those reasons alone, I think we are the center point. But if we expect diaspora Jews to relate to us in that way, then we need to not just accept the legitimacy of diaspora criticism, but welcome it, as difficult as it is. And it's especially difficult during war. And and so ideologically, I believe that it's not just legitimate, but necessary. Emotionally, during war, I feel very differently. So that the head and the heart are not always in sync. and especially when I've had a kid in at war, I did not appreciate diaspora protests, even though in principle I affirm the right and maybe necessity of that level of involvement. I
Mhm.
think that and during the judicial assault in the year leading up to October 7th, I was part of an effort together with two other North American Israelis of North American background, Israeli writers, Mati Friedman and Danny Gordis. We wrote an open letter to
Right.
diaspora Jews, urging them to support the democracy movement. I think this is different in that um, for diaspora Jews to protest against the war will have absolutely no impact. Uh, there will be very few Israelis who will appreciate that. Even and the question also is protesting the war in what way? Uh, if it's putting all of the onus on Israel, then for me that's a problem. Again, that doesn't mean that diaspora Jews don't have the right to express that, and I mean the right within a Jewish um, uh, within a definition of Jewish citizenship. That is your right to to protest in any way you want. I'm just saying that what I'm comfortable most with is framing the protest in a way that doesn't ignore the wider context.
Right, and getting back to your, I forget which front it was. Yes, I'm sorry, but
Me too.
not contributing to the delegitimization of the entire effort.
Yes.
I don't, though Zionism as a word, it's become such a dirty word that I often find myself using things like the Jewish movement for self-determination. Like I want to, because you can't use the word Zionism in certain places without people just going nuts. So, as an historian of the Jews of Europe, I know where Zionism came from, and it came from an imperial context of national self-determination for many, many peoples. And people forget that. And well, the people don't know any history, so whatever, let's just move on from that. But I think that the one of the questions for those in the diaspora is criticism and how it has gotten coupled with this sort of this large scale delegitimization, which you spoke about, and how to articulate a critique of the government policies without a critique of the existence of the state and of all and demographically of half, if not more, of the Jewish people. And I think that that doesn't, I don't have an answer, but I think that's the thin line that it's hard for many people to understand and to
Yeah, and of
articulate.
course, criticism gets conflated, legitimate criticism gets conflated with demonization, with delegitimization,
Right.
and sometimes I'll read something in the Times that a professor somewhere is being is his position is being threatened because he criticized Israel, and then you read what the criticism was, and you say, well, that's not criticism. No other country would regard that as criticism. To deny a country's right to exist is not to criticize a country, and there is this strange conflation of criticizing policies with criticizing Israel's existence. That's really more and more the case.
Right. Well, I don't want to go down the road of then what's the role of censoring professors, not because I am one, but just again, the issue of what role should a government have in censoring intellectual discourse, even if it's loathsome intellectual discourse. So let's just leave that aside. We're not going to be able to answer that today, and that wasn't really part of your talk. So let me many people are wondering how you feel about the international community right now seemingly endorsing the idea of the two-state solution, really is what it is, which for the last couple of years, and particularly under Netanyahu's watch, has not really been viable. One could argue that his whole strategy, the concepcia vis-a-vis Hamas, was to deny the PA, the Palestinian Authority, which was the representative for a two-state solution. But it seems that the world is now piling on this recognition project. Many people criticize this as being a reward for terrorism, right? And I just wonder how you grapple with those things. I have my own feelings about the rhetoric, but rewarding terrorism. And I also am not a geopolitical strategist, but I know you don't make peace with your friends. I know you make peace with your enemies. So where do you stand on this very fraught, and maybe the news conference today is going to solve this for us, but what do you think
Well,
about that?
the international community, or rather Europe and large parts of Europe and Canada and Australia, didn't recognize a two-state solution. The international community has recognized the two-state solution now for 40 years. It's what they recognized was a non-existent Palestinian state. And I don't need to speculate about whether this was or was not a reward for terrorism. All I have to do is listen to how Hamas speaks about this recognition to the Arab world and to their own people. And they say this is the vindication of October 7th. And the truth is they're right. It is a vindication of October 7th, because none of this would have happened had October 7th not happened. And so there's something so appalling about the willful naivete of large parts of the West. And, and the West has no right to be as naive as it is in dealing with the Middle East and dealing with Hamas. And of course it was a reward to Hamas. And it happened at the moment when we're hearing more and more voices coming out of Gaza of people saying, Hamas has brought a disaster on us. In the same way that we heard many, Germans and Japanese after World War II saying, well, that, as we say in Brooklyn, that didn't work out so good, and we were starting to hear that in Gaza. Of course, Hamas is trying to suppress those voices. But then important parts of the international community hand Hamas an extraordinary argument, which is, okay, we've suffered the last 2 years, but the only way you're going to get a state is through an October 7th. And that argument certainly has credibility.
And that argument will not fly with the Israeli public, even those who are critical of the current government. So that's another thing that only, I think,
Absolutely not.
Strengthens.
The
Right.
Israeli public, you had a few voices. You have a few people on the left who welcome the recognition. A few of my friends who have, but those voices are so marginal. And the overwhelming majority of Israelis are rightly outraged and disgusted.
Okay, the last question, and again, there are others. And so for those of you out there, I did make a list, but I'm mindful of the time. This is something that, as an historian of Jews and the ways in which Jewish texts continue to inform Jewish life, even for those Jews who define themselves as either secular and cultural, I always find that interesting. To what degree do you, or how do you grapple with, if you will, some of the textuality, the rhetoric of biblical Israel, the book of Joshua, for example, the phraseology about Purim, of Amalek, right? And I'm thinking of my late colleague, Elliot Horowitz's book about Purim and violence, right? Reckless rights. Those of us who have a broad sweep, one cannot ignore rhetorical narratives that talk about obliterating the enemy, right? Obliterating the enemy. And to what degree do you see that playing out in contemporary Israel, not only among the far right, but others? And what does one do with that if one is faithful, if you will, to to the narratives of the Jewish past, as you start. And one of your points was about the Jewish story. So that's part of the Jewish story, right?
It
That is
is
part of the
part of the
Jewish story.
Jewish story. It is. And there are multiple streams in the Jewish story.
Right.
And what one chooses to emphasize will tell you what kind of Judaism you have. And it works that way in any religion. You know,
Yeah, of
you
course.
emphasize the scriptural passages that resonate most deeply with you, and you kind of downplay the embarrassing scriptural passages. And the one of the great tasks of rabbinic Judaism was to try to help the Jewish people adjust to powerlessness. And part of that process was to sublimate the more violent elements of the biblical story into a spiritual narrative. So, for example, Hanukkah. The rabbis downplayed the miracle of Hanukkah,
Military.
the military, and emphasized the miracle of the lights, and many examples of that. And when when the Jews began returning home, we had the need to reinvent a military ethos, which had been dormant for almost 2,000 years. And Jews, I suppose many Jews assumed that those elements had disappeared. Now, they hadn't disappeared.
Right.
The archetypes don't disappear. You know, every people has archetypes. We have some very positive archetypes, and we have some very negative archetypes. And 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 so we began to resurrect the story, the stories of biblical heroism. We resurrected the Maccabees. We even resurrected Bar Kokhba, which was a more problematic move, because Bar Kokhba, the rabbis despised and feared Bar Kokhba.
Or Koziva. Right.
And that's right. And so but I think that the resurrection of a Jewish military ethos rooted in the biblical past was unavoidable, because the Jewish people desperately needed to believe in its ability to defend itself, especially in the 20th century. And so there was a very fine line that the Zionists walked in resurrecting this military tradition while downplaying some of the more problematic elements. And what we've seen in recent decades emerging through religious Zionism, and there's a great irony here, because religious Zionism was once one of the most moderate expressions of Zionism. But through the settlement movement and the Six-Day War, of course, as a turning point, we've seen a resurrection of brutal archetypes that we really thought had disappeared from Jewish history. And in a sense, I'm grateful that these archetypes have reemerged, because we need to confront this in ourselves. And that's one of the, paradoxically, it's one of the reasons why I actually feel hopeful in this period.
Good. Let's make sure this is our summation.
Yeah, I mean, it's not your typical, Am Yisrael Chai hope that I'm going to end with. It's a kind of a strange, maybe even a little convoluted hope. But I believe that one of the reasons we came back home was to confront ourselves, to confront certain unresolved elements that were, again, suppressed during the 2,000 years of exile because we didn't have power, and now have reemerged. And that's part of our work as a sovereign people, is to confront our unresolved elements, our national flaws. And we don't have time to. We could speak for hours about the biblical archetypes that have reemerged in the Jewish people. I would just say very briefly, ingratitude, which the Jews in the desert revealed, and which was such a major part of our founding story, in gratitude toward God, in gratitude toward Moses. 5 minutes after we received the Torah in Revelation, we're dancing in a pagan rite around the golden calf. Not our finest moment, but it really expresses this kind of ingratitude, which we see among parts of the Jewish people today toward the state, the Haredim, the state that protects them, that allows them to thrive. Jewish anti-Zionists, more in American Jewry than anywhere else. But what a profound expression of biblical ingratitude to the movement that saved the Jewish people, that made the anti-Zionist Jews feel confident enough and safe enough as Jews that they could turn against Jewish power, which was inconceivable after the Shoah. So these are some of the
It's
issues.
inconceivable, but it's what we're living with. So
It's what we're
there's
living
been
with.
this resurgence of diaspora nationalism. It drives me crazy as a
And
scholar of the
so,
Jewish left in the book.
yes,
Yeah.
and I paired that together with the rise or return of an extreme ultra-nationalist right, the
Yeah.
rise of a self-negating Jewish anti-Zionism with an ultra-nationalist anti-democratic movement. These are the two great dangers, internal dangers, facing the Jewish people. In Israel, my job is to contain the rise of the zealots, the ultra-nationalist zealots. And in the diaspora, I believe your job is to contain the rise of the Jewish anti-Zionists. And if we can figure out how to do that for the coming year, I think we're going to have a much better year than we did in the previous year.
Okay, well, I'm going to take that as hope and
Yeah,
optimism,
yes, I
a
think so.
charge. I want to thank you. I know that I could really continue this conversation with you for a long time. We started when we did our prep. I have many thoughts about all of these issues, and but I thank you over and over again for your clarity and for your willingness to sort of stand in the middle with with being buffeted by really difficult issues and living in Israel, and as you said, listening now to the military, to the burying of another soldier. You know, that is something that so many Americans, because we do not have a compulsory draft, have no conception of what the obligations of a free democracy are. So that's I thank you for that, and I thank you for answering the questions that you did receive. I want to thank the audience and apologize that I couldn't get to all of them. And some of you raised your hands, but there was no way to call on you because this is a webinar. So in the future, make sure you put your questions in the chat. And then I have to do a little publicity here for the Bildner Center. I want to emphasize again, and it's very important in this particular moment, that people understand that the programming of the Alan and Joan Bildner Center for the Study of Jewish Life is majority self-supporting. So if you've enjoyed our webinars, our free online classes, our film festival, which we do charge a moderate amount for because we have to because of the exorbitant costs of showing films, and films that you just can't see anywhere, please consider us as part of your philanthropic giving, if that's what you do, and you should do that. That is what you're supposed to do. On October 20th, Professor Benjamin Nathans from University of Pennsylvania, who's an extraordinary historian of Russian and Soviet Jewry, who I'm happy to say we invited way before he won the Pulitzer Prize for his new book on refuseniks and rights defenders, Jews in the Soviet dissident movement. He will be speaking in person on October 20th in Trays Hall on the Douglas College campus. And we will be selling tickets for the annual film festival at Ben Nathan's talk. Ticket sales for the film festival go online already. I think October 17th. I'm probably getting the date wrong, but October 16th. I got that right a little bit. October 16th. And the annual Jewish Film Festival will run in person from November 6th to November 16th. And we have, as always, films from Israel, films that grapple with Israeli and Jewish identity, as well as films from the diaspora. And again, many times we have preempted the New York Jewish Film Festival and Boston and Philly and Toronto with films that we've shown. We also always try to have speakers and talkbacks at the most important films. So please check our website for the film festival schedule. On Wednesdays in December, the 3rd, the 10th, and the 17th, our visiting scholar, Dr. Daniel Stein Koken, and Yossi, you can tune in for this too, is doing a course called Points on the Map: The Rhetoric and Representations of the Jewish Presence in the Land and State of Israel. This is a cutting-edge digital humanities course mapping all kinds of settlements in the land and state of Israel through GIS, which is sort of state-of-the-art mapping techniques. So I hope you'll join us for that. That's at 7 p.m., December 3rd, 10th, and 17th. And then our last in-person event will be Dr. Professor Joseph A. Skloot presenting on From Clay Tablet to Digital Tablet, the History of Jewish Books. And if you couldn't figure it out already, you should know that this year's programming is being done in cooperation with the Rutgers Initiative of the Book in the English department and with the Scarlet Letter Press, which is an actual physical press that students can use. And we, in the Department of Jewish Studies and the Bildner Center, will be hosting events for students. So to all of you, thank you for tuning in. May we all, as it is said in Israel, merit besorot tovot, better news in the coming year. And thank you again, Yossi Klein Halevi, for a wonderful talk.
Thank you, Nancy, and Shana Tova, everyone. Chatima
Shana tova, gama chatima tova, everyone. Bye-bye.